We've found over many years, actually, that in the general population, that's to say the non-autistic population, there are these on average sex or gender differences, both in empathy and in systemizing. So what we find in small-scale studies is that girls and women on average score higher on tests of empathy and on measures of empathy, and boys and men on average score higher on tests of systemizing and measures of systemizing. I say small scale because back in the day, we would be testing a few hundred people. But now you can do online research. You can really do research at scale. So we published a study back in 2018, which was 600,000 people taking the empathy quotient, the EQ, and the systemizing quotient, the SQ. They did it online, so that's how we could achieve such large sample sizes. And we found, sure enough, replicating the smaller studies, that women on average score higher on the EQ and men on average score higher on the SQ.
How big a difference is it in standard deviation terms?
It's a great question. It's a significant difference. I'd need to look up the effect size and I could, contact you after the conversation. But it's a significant difference. And especially when you have these large samples, they jump out at you. They were robust gender differences. We've also used a performance test of empathy called the eyes test. It's also called the reading the mind in the eyes test, where you look at photographs of people's eyes. And the test is whether you can infer what someone might be thinking or feeling just from looking at the emotional expression around the eyes. Because the eyes...
Right, so that's a gestalt.
It's a gestalt, yeah. I mean, it is. If you imagine like a letterbox, you've only got this much information, but it turns out to be very rich in information about another person's state of mind. And women, on average, score higher on it's called the reading the mind in the eyes test, compared to men. And just a few years ago, 2022, we published a study showing across 57 different countries, so this was kind of independent of culture, you see this female superiority on the test.
Are there tests that are that straightforward on the systemizing side that show the male advantage?
There are. I mean, one quite old one, which you may remember, is called the embedded figures test, where you have to find a target as quickly as you can that's embedded in a larger design. And men are faster and more accurate in finding the part within the whole. So that might be a systemizing test. We've just completed the development of another test, which is more about mechanical reasoning, asking people whether a lever will move up or down depending on the cogwheels that are moving in different directions. So you're having to it's kind of like looking inside an old-fashioned watch to understand the drivers, the cogwheels driving movements of levers. And males perform faster and more, higher. They score higher on average on that test. So these are controversial areas, as you know, because, the field of sex difference research or gender differences research understandably gets a lot of pushback. We all want a society where there's gender equality. But that's more about our social values. It's not necessarily a scientific question about whether male and female children and adults, whether their minds work in the same way on average. And I keep using those two words, on average, because the best we can do as scientists is compare groups of females and groups of males on these different measures and see if we find a difference.
In the temperament literature, the differences in agreeableness, which I think are most closely related to empathizing, they maximize in gender-neutral societies. They don't minimize, right? So So in this, this is not controversial research from the technical perspective because it's been unbelievably well established. So you can rank order countries by the degree to which they've implemented sexual, say, parity in the law and in society on sexual grounds. And then you can look at the differences in magnitude of temperament differences between men and women. And what you find is clearly the case that, well, for example, differences in agreeableness and neuroticism are maximized in the Scandinavian countries. So if you flatten out the environmental variation, you seem to maximize the genetic variation. And I'm curious with regards to empathizing and systemizing, if you did the same analysis, do you know if there's any evidence that?
It's a great question. I haven't seen any research on it. But first of all, going back to your question about is empathy closest to agreeableness if we think about the big 5 personality dimensions, that makes sense to me. And there may be some data out there that confirms a correlation. But agreeableness, I would say, and you're the personality psychologist here between the two of us. So you tell me, but agreeableness to me involves keeping track of how someone else is feeling and what they might be thinking. You and I are having a very polite conversation, so we're being very agreeable, probably because we don't want to insult each other. We don't want to hurt each other's feelings. So we're kind of exercising our agreeableness, but that is really what I was calling empathy earlier on. If you don't care about, the other person's feelings, you can be as rude as you like. Driving your point home in a debate, you could be very blunt. You could, you could be very direct. You could be very, insulting. There's all kinds of, different ways that you could use language, which would not be agreeable, even if you're making a very logical point. So, I think I'd agree with you on that kind of overlap between these dimensions of individual differences.
Well, the most relevant element of that, I would say, is not so much the somewhat obvious point that agreeableness and empathizing might be associated. I would say what's more interesting from a scientific and social perspective is whether low agreeableness is associated with systemizing. Because one of the things that's peculiar about the personality and psychopathology research is that there's a tremendous number of positive trait names and identifiers on the empathizing side, on the agreeable side, but there's very little positive about the disagreeable side. And that's a big mistake because it's a normal distribution for a reason. And there's just as many reasons to be disagreeable as there are to be agreeable. The question is, this is a comic trope with regard to engineers because they tend to be somewhat parodied as blunt and disagreeable in their prioritization of systemizing over empathizing. Do you ever watch The Big Bang Theory?
Of course. Yeah.
Yes. Well, so I mean, all of the humor in The Big Bang Theory is systemizing over empathizing.
Yeah.
Pretty much.
And that character, what's the name of the main character in The Big Bang Theory?
The gangly physicist. Is it Stephen? Simon?
No, neither of those. It'll come back to both of us in a second. But some people are wonder whether he's playing the role of an autistic person. Because he's fascinated by science and the world of systems and technology. But he may not be paying equal attention to other people's feelings in the room. We have this phrase, read the room. Autistic people and maybe, some engineers may be less focused on reading the room because they're focused on understanding the system and making sure it's working. Right now, you and I are surrounded by mechanics and engineers making sure that the cameras are working fine, the sound systems are working fine, and that's their job. That's their talent, and they may be kind of less, focused on are we both comfortable or are we communicating? Are we on the same topic? they're more kind of focusing on the engineering of our interaction or of the situation. But coming back to gender, just because I know that, this is again a topic of mutual interest. The reason I say on average gender differences is you can find individuals who are atypical for their gender. When we do those big studies, we've classified the population into people who lean more towards empathy than systemizing, or those who lean more towards systemizing than empathy. So those are two brain types. We call them type E and type S. And then there are people in the middle who are kind of equal in their empathy and their systemizing. We call them type B for balanced. And then there are people at the extremes, people who empathize non-stop, but may find systemizing challenging, and vice versa. People who systemize non-stop and may find empathy challenging. And in that big online study, we had 36,000 autistic people take part. And they tend to be in the type S profile. So leaning more towards systems than empathy, or even in the extreme type S, where there's a bigger discrepancy between their systemizing and their empathy.